I have an odd recollection of the earliest phase of my life that I want to share. The first part of my life was spent in 3 countries. This, by the way, was not a picture of me, but a picture of Ernest Hemingway. I don't mind sharing my life, and I don't mind that mine started like his or looked like his, as long as the ending might be different. I was born in this place, Quinta Covadonga, a neighborhood of Havana, in a hospital before I left there at the age of 7 for Madrid. And my time was as interesting as that name. Quinta means like mainstay place or hut, etc. And Covadonga means Covadonna, or the cave of the lady, referring to the Virgin Mary. This neighborhood, of course, was linked at that time to the Asturianos, the people from Asturias, that small, weird principality of northwest Spain, known for rugged people, rugged coastline, a rugged belief in religious miracles. And, of course, in my life, I think, as that of many other people, you could sort of say that there was a religious miracle, because as I was born, I acquired a fast-moving infection that was spreading all over the hospital's natal ward. And the incubation room where newborns were placed was one where I went, and I was surrounded by 9 other babies, none of whom survived that disease long enough to leave the hospital. It wasn't pretty, but then again, maybe the darkness of a new world is rarely welcoming. For the first years of my life, the ones I remember quite clearly for some reason, I grew up in the 10th floor of this building here, Malecón 51. It was one of the tallest and most recognizable buildings in Havana. It still remains that way. It's the boulevard of that city, as you can see there, where the place itself, the metropolis, meets the ocean head-on. Now, that building is extraordinary for several reasons, including the design, as you can actually see from this car shot here. Most of the building is designed so that you can actually see the ocean and see the Malecón. And so it had a lanai with an angled wall that was very stylish. And it helped a little boy look almost straight down. Here's the room, for example, where I was. My father had a drawing table there. I know that doesn't look like that anymore because, of course, it's no longer a workplace and someone else lives there. But you can see what that looked like. And it was really something to behold. And looking down is something I did do. You could look down and see all kinds of things. I remember the first time I ever saw a stingray. Amazing monsters just sort of going around near that seawall. And then there were other dark fish in the ocean that I couldn't quite make out. They turned out to be Russian submarines entering the Bay of Havana. And you could see them quite clearly far away because ours was the only high-rise building close to the mouth of that bay. In fact, if you look at almost any aerial photograph, you can see that the tallest building nearest to the mouth of the bay, imagine being on one of the top floors of that, and what you would take in. It was an extraordinary sight, quite a world. And it's probably the one thing I do miss about being in Havana. Not surprising. But as I say, you could see all kinds of things when you look down. It was a world that was open to you in so many ways. One of the things I remember seeing, much of what I saw, I couldn't make out for a long time. You could look straight down. As I say, practically one time I saw tanks marking up the pavement, and those tread marks remained there forever. And one time I saw a shootout in which my father, realizing that I had seen it, told me that in fact it was only the tire of a parked car that had accidentally exploded, like a blowout on a parked car. In any case, it wasn't all bad and weird, but it was always wondrous. One of the things I do remember, for example, and that all children would consider very important, is something like the ice cream palace. Havana had the most opulent parlor on the planet. The futurist sort of structure called La Copelia, right in the middle of the city, visible today from practically anywhere. It's unique in its architecture. It's the only building that's not entirely rectangular, as you can actually see in these photographs. It just sort of stands there as if something out of War of the Worlds had come down onto the city and decided, instead of dispensing death rays, it was going to dispense ice cream. And as a little child, when you approached that place, it was like approaching a spaceship. And especially if you're high on sugar from your ice cream, you'd be leaving there in a state of absolute irrefutable wonder. When you walked in, you basically had to, it was like you were entering a spaceship. There was a spiral staircase going in up to the parlor, and or any place you wanted to be, any angle would offer you a marvelous view. It looked as if the building itself was actually motorized. I think it still looks that way today. And the architects were smart enough to also place, for people who wanted to just enjoy the outside, a little patio, so that no matter where you were, Sunday was a ritual for every family. It was an extraordinary thing. And so that was it, really something extraordinary. You would walk there, you would go in, and it was there you were, entering this ice cream spaceship. And as I say, if you go to Havana, you can still go there today. La Copelia is still open. You can still get ice cream. So my father, as I said, had been an architect, and he had been a student at the University of Havana in the School of Architecture. He hurried to finish graduate school because his own family was working to help support him through those studies. And when he graduated in 1956, many of his own friends had a course or two remaining to complete, and they weren't really worried. They were in no hurry to go ahead and finish. But by November, a radical student group had forced the university to close. And many of those students behind that were from the architecture school itself. And my father, I remember growing up, told me the story of one of the inciters, one of the instigators, this man named Jose Antonio Echeverria. He's still remembered in some sort of maybe romantic retrospective, because he was against Batista, but not necessarily pro-Castro. He was rather suspicious of Castro's intent. But what Echeverria did actually helped Castro take over, even though that wasn't necessarily his intent. Castro and Echeverria had known each other, and Echeverria was a strictly middle-class romanticist from the city. Castro was a rather upper-class guy, had gone to law school, but he was wily and he was violent. And I think Echeverria, who was kind of a sweet guy in many ways by himself, was not entirely happy with the militarization that was in Castro's mind. So when you start a revolution, you end up joining up with a lot of people who are driven by ideals. And 1 year after the university closed, this former student and two others, all now agitators, broke into Radio Reloj, which is the national radio station of Havana, and at gunpoint, they forced the reading of this rant, announcing that the revolution had, as of that moment, begun. Echeverria had arranged it so that several other students were making an attempt on the palace at that very moment. There was a timing issue, and so he read this off too soon, thereby alerting the troops by the palace that an attack was coming when it was not yet there. Nevertheless, he also read at the very top of his voice, he was very excited, obviously, and making this accusation of Batista's corruption, he declared this coup underway at the National Palace and took a few shots at the window as he left. His voice was so loud that he overdrove the microphone. And so that was a huge problem, because as he overdrove the microphone, the signal shut off. And so therefore, neither the coup took place, nor was he able to, with his very considerably charismatic personality, able to get his message across more than a few seconds, really, of the transmission. It exists today. You can hear it. In any case, they left the station and drove a few blocks where a patrol car chanced upon them. Naturally, the patrol car had already been alerted to the radio announcement, and a gunfight ensued, and Echeverria was killed almost instantly, since he had, as I say, shouted into the microphones and caused much of the signal to be shut off. Much of what he had to say was never transmitted. So a probably good idea for a coup went wrong in almost every way. And that goes to show how different his view of a takeover would be from Castro's, which was clockwork and complete in almost every way, I'm sorry to say. But nevertheless, he's held up as a kind of model for what could have happened, what could have been the potential Cuba. He wasn't necessarily averse to violence. I mean, when they found his body, the police moved him. They did discover he was wearing several live hand grenades on his own belt. So who knows how he would have used them. Anything could have happened, right? That's the nature of revolution. It always begins with chaos and romanticism. And it takes on different forms over time. In any case, such was his life, and it didn't help much because the turmoil of the city meant that Batista became even more repressive. And that year, until about 1960, when the university opened much later, was full of all kinds of unrest, disorder, and confusion. My father had mentioned Echeverria when I was very young, as I say, and although it is said that his coup would have prevented Castro from rising to power, he was suspicious, my father was, of both men, who he found impulsive and even dangerous. And he had come across another guy who himself was another revolutionary to come in accidental contact, as it were, with my family. One of the better-known heroes of the revolution was this man here, Ernesto Guevara, El Che. He's been there in 1959, 3 years before my own mother met him. Like James Dean, Che has remained an icon on the t-shirt of many kids who are too young to understand the man. But thinking of the icon in romantic ways, imagine this rebel that now seems perennially attached to his image. I mean, growing up in an ideological household himself, it's evident from the start that Che's own fate was decided early. But regardless, his was a face meant for murals. I mean, I think you could say that he was known for this crucial role in the Cuban Revolution and the establishment of a new Cuban state intended to be less repressive than what had come before in Batista, but which in fact turned out to be much worse than any variation of its possible future otherwise. And Che was, of course, not himself from Cuba. He was from Argentina, and he was in other countries in Latin America seeking to bring medical welfare. He was a trained doctor, and the burdens of social justice kept getting in his way until medicine itself, I think it's fair to say, became secondary to the needs of improving his ideals of government. But considering how he died, it's fairly obvious that he became a beast of the idealism's own burdens, one of which was, if you like, maybe a betrayal of the demagogue who he was serving. Fidel Castro was the cancer of Cuba, the metastasis of communism into later generations that really essentially had no business being involved in an antiquated ideology. I mean, in fact, I think it's fair to say that no generation from any communist country has ever improved the conditions of its own society, or even done well by itself. So I think realizing this fact, communists are faced with really the only real option, either living out the hypocrisy of equality while creating a kind of closed, two-faced elite, which is what the oligarchs do over in Russia, or like other options. I mean, Castro, the man responsible for Che's death, ordered that his life be ironically commemorated in signs that display prominently all over Cuba. I mean, I wonder what his ghost would say about having his life be exchanged for a poster image. It's as if, I think, even the final expression on his face after he was shot down in Bolivia, is looking into the future, almost musing at that irony, namely that it wasn't social injustice or capitalism that cost him his life, but rather his friend, the very leader that he chose to help bring to power, who had finished him off in just a few years. Of course, by then, the doctrine Che had already been left far behind, and he, I think, had learned, as one source says, to relish the rituals of the firing squad. Who knows what he was thinking in his last days? I think the life of an idealist can justify many things in the beginning, which it finds itself unable to imagine or reconcile with its early life later on. I mean, the young Che was this interesting guy. He was a doctor. He was a kind of athletic dude. He was kind of very interested in helping people, and you can come a long way from humble and dignified roots. But I think also it's the ideals that can turn into a search for power that can devour almost any ego. I mean, I think it's just how we're made. He left a family behind. He didn't do anything really powerful for the revolution at all. Intellectual guy, but I mean, I think revolutions don't really end up using intellectuals. Intellectuals become mouthpieces for the revolution, any revolution. And soon after that, someone else takes over. In a few years, Che himself had gone from being that intellectual and humanitarian to somebody rather more cold-blooded. Goodbye, Che. But before we move on, here's a brief family anecdote that I can remember. By 1959, when Castro became dictator, the established classes realized that they would be targeted by thugs in government and had little choice but to leave. It's a familiar story when abuse takes power. So, having graduated in 1956, my father had years of professional experience for which his own cohort, who never graduated at that time, weren't qualified. So by 1960, they returned to the university, but by then he was already a professor. He was teaching his own friends. But, by 1959, there were only 54 architects in all of Cuba. And that's why he was offered a professorship. And by 1962, the desire of Cuba to follow the communist model included the model of communist architecture throughout Eastern Europe, the Eastern Bloc. And that led to an invitation for him to travel to Germany, USSR, Poland, all these other countries for several months. And my mother wanted to go, but she was not invited. She found herself, therefore, in the National Bank, which fell under Che's rule, as he had been president of the bank. Probably the only national treasurer to sign, his currency with his own name, just like Che. And so she walks in there, and, it's really fascinating. I mean, she was there to arrange for a loan, or try to arrange for some money, to be able to gain access to foreign currency so she could join my father in Europe. And the vice president of the bank was explaining to her that no, financial help was not possible. And she was only a first-year architecture student herself, and money for the revolution was very tight. So it was going to be almost impossible, and he turned her down. But just then, Che chanced in on his way to his office, probably, I guess. And he noticed my mother and inquired about the discussion. So he then, when he heard about what was going on, he turned to the bank officer and told him that she would make this great model of a Cuban woman abroad, and with that the authority was given to her for her funds, and he encouraged her to represent Cuba proudly in the Eastern Bloc. And so with that, she joined my father in Berlin, Dresden, Moscow, Leningrad, Prague, elsewhere. I have many other experiences to recall from my time in Cuba, incidentally, but almost all of them are lamentable, I think, maybe in some way, ultimately. One of the most piercing was when my father came home one day. He was languid and pale and declared, "I've seen a madman. We have to get out of here." My father had to help coordinate the development of a kind of sports and cultural center, apparently decided at the last minute by Castro. It was supposed to be built with an impossibly short construction deadline, and on the days when the work was particularly long, my father would sleep only a few hours in the mezzanine of a theater that was to be the opening site for the celebrations. And on one night, the lights came on in the empty theater, and he peered out onto the stage. And Castro had wanted to rehearse his speech for the inauguration. And my father heard this dictator describe how these ideas of planning, etc., had been in development for years, and he just heard all these other patent falsehoods. And I can only imagine looking at the real Castro as opposed to what everybody else was naively imagining. Must have been a terribly disappointing experience, enough to spook him. So the decision was made to leave the country somehow. And we applied for exit visas, and in time one single visa came through just for him, alone. And it was the unwritten policy of the Cuban government to release families one member at a time, separated by many years, so they could destroy the family as such. And by the time the last person left, everybody in the second country had already grown up and made their lives anew. So my mother encouraged, nevertheless, my father to leave, and he reluctantly walked out the door, headed to the airport. So that was going to be the last time, surely, that I was to see him. And there was nothing for us, of course. From the airport, he decided to make a phone call us at one last moment. He approached the payphone, and there he called us. He spoke to me, and he broke down. I'd never heard my father crying before, and he said he couldn't leave us. And so he turned down the only chance that he'd have, finally, to escape this terrible place. He walked out of the airport and found his way back home, and he returned home soon after that, back there. It's the way it is. You have to know what your place is, even if the future is much more perilous. He wanted very badly to leave the country, but he couldn't leave us behind. I give him a lot of credit for that. I know a lot of other families didn't do that. In any case, not long afterward, my father was suspected of consorting with anti-revolutionary enemies. Suspicion was in the air everywhere, of course. And he told my mother that he was being followed, and it's not something that she necessarily believed. But he was getting around everywhere in buses, and there was an air of mystical suspicion in the air. It was a very 1984 time. All of the idealism had become replaced by a kind of weird control, and people no longer felt that they were living in the same country that they had envisioned when they backed Castro's ideals. But people like my father knew that they were being followed. Notes, dossiers, everything was being kept on people. That was the word everywhere. Well, you can imagine my mother didn't believe him. So they had arguments about this. He didn't want to go out. She didn't care. It was very difficult on them. He didn't have a job for reasons that had to do with his leaving the country. So he took her with him on a walk and said, "Let's get in the bus. I'll show you something." So they did. Once in the bus, he started pointing out to her what seemed like different random people getting on and off the bus. But this random group of everyday people was in fact not a random group. It was really just the same group, a small group of individuals who were recognizable in no way except for the fact that he noticed, and he pointed out to her. He would point out that they would exit the bus. These people would approach a car that was following the bus, and then they would get in the car, and then shortly after they would re-enter the bus wearing different shirts or coats, etc. Look at the shoes, he pointed out. They're always the same. I think there's a mention of something like this in a Le Carré novel. She realized what was happening. When you're following people, you can change pretty much anything. You can wear hats, you can even put on wigs, you can get overcoats, etc. But it's harder to change shoes when you're on the run. So shortly afterward, men and women at the university faculty were called in to testify in a committee on the state of their allegiance to the communist revolution. Every professor was going to face his inquisitors. A dossier would be opened and questions would be asked. Are you a loyal member of the revolution? Oh yes, of course I am. Whereupon a report would be pulled out of a packet stating that on given days the subject had been observed sticking closely to church-oriented social activities, for example. And from this, the committee would launch into an insulting tirade, and with a slam of the dossier, the accused would be called to report to Oriente, 800 kilometers away, for an indefinite period of time, cutting cane, every career effectively brought to an end by a sudden fate. All these proceedings were televised so that the shaming could be made as public as possible. Castro reveled in social sadism, so on the day that my father was called to this committee, he knew that this was going to happen. And when asked if he was a loyal member of the revolution, he denied their chance to create a scandal by just telling them the truth. No, I'm not. I plan to leave the country as soon as possible, having little with which to contradict this. Surprising admission, they closed his file and dismissed him. By the time he arrived in the apartment, barely 15 minutes later, everything had happened. He'd lost his job, etc. And he'd been sent out to go cut cane. My mother went to go find him in Oriente. She came from there, and she found this group was having its usual water and rice lunch, and when asked about why they were inquiring about him, she was dressed in a uniform. She simply replied that he was wanted by a commanding officer, and she illegally took him out. We went back to Havana. They liked the joke that, of course, they're still waiting for him for lunch. Now, having no money, he decided to make 2 rubber stamps fashioned with a blade to be dipped inside ink, one red, one blue. And we'd get paper. My mother would cut it. My sister and I would dip into the refuse barrel behind this weird factory, and we retrieved this gummy substance that we used to use as glue. And these envelopes were the communications medium for a lot of Cubans, writing to ask for help and for money. And so sales of this prized object helped us eat for a long time because my father was no longer an architect. There was a place called also El Laguito, a little lake, where the central office for exit visas was located. And we had to take a bus there to apply for exit visas. In the lobby was this table with some very large and hostile men whose job it was to dispirit and turn away applicants who were known as gusanos, worms. Eventually, we received the visas, but how all this happened is kind of crazy. We would get called at all hours, mostly late at night, to be in the airport in 35 minutes. Something insane. We'd rush into our suitcases, be turned away without reason. Another month would pass. Another late night. We learned to sleep fully clothed, all suitcases packed by our beds, so we could leave quickly. And one day we made it. We went through this usual humiliation of questions and waiting, and finally we were moved to a room with a glass wall on which we could see the plane on the tarmac. It was our gate. We weren't allowed to take anything with us. My father's architectural diploma even couldn't be taken, nothing of value. And we were at this table facing a soldier who resembled Che. They all did. Everybody wanted that look. He was the Clark Gable of, Cuban soldiers. And he pointed at my father's gold ring. My father had to remove it and give it to him. We were told to empty our pockets. My father found this nickel and he put it on this table. It was the only money we had. We left, and he put the money on the table and he chuckled. And this weird guy, this angry soldier, smacked his palm on the coin and he pulled it toward him. Then he told us to get out, pointing toward the plane. And my last memory of this was looking at that guy putting that last 5 cents into his pocket. Anyway, I read somewhere that, economic growth spreads to all regions of the world during the 20th century. And it sort of sounds true, but it's a little incomplete. I mean, if we read the United Nations 2011 Human Development Report, you learn that 40 of the poorest countries in the world, out of those 40, 37 are in Africa. And many of these have never received any industrialized infrastructure. And harder to, I think, to justify still is the rampant poverty of countries that began to modernize with industry and whose governments were too corrupt or incompetent to continue a trend that was underway. Countries like Cuba. And this came not from the people of the government, which got into the rant about its conditions caused by other countries. Of course, now, after 6 decades, when the world has changed so much, it's impossible to keep blaming external causes that were, in the 1950s so obvious. I mean, countries back then like Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, India, and China have really grown and prospered, but Cuba's infant mortality rate is now the 24th highest in the world. You could ask, doesn't this have to do something with communism, which has had total control of that country for 60 years? I mean, you can't be blaming an outside force for 6 decades. You have to be able to, take a little responsibility for what the people haven't received themselves over time. I think, Cuba's notion of industry is a notion that's not at all the notion of industrialized countries in Europe and the United States. Because you can't create industry with ideology. That's one of the problems of romance, right? Everybody knows you have to have romance at the beginning, but it's a commitment thereafter. This is the work of ideology, the antithesis, in my view, of progress, when progress, as we have now learned, has become the caption of the century. It's hard to imagine, hard to reconcile all of the things that have happened. Here's I love this photograph, La Maravilla, the marvel, and there's a person just sort of looking at it, and there's nothing there. I mean, when you look at places like this, even the most embattled parts of a city, like Detroit, seem somehow less of an urban wilderness than the capital of the largest country in the Caribbean. I'll leave you with that. Thanks. Okay. Take care.